everyone. Just wanted to welcome you to our webinar this evening by Rose and Rex, Positive Language Strategies for Parents. Thank you so much for joining. I know that many of you have very young children at home, babies at home, some of you are expecting, and time is precious. So thank you so much for being here. It was a great way for me this evening to let my husband tackle bedtime with my own children and talk to you instead. So thanks for being here. For those of you who I haven't yet met, either virtually or in person, I'm Lauren Vien, Education Director of Rose and Rex, and I have a master's in early childhood education and special education from NYU. I taught in Manhattan preschools for over 10 years before joining the Rose and Rex team as education director. And as I mentioned before, most importantly, I'm the mother of two young children. My son Henry just turned 4, and my daughter Violet just recently turned 2. So, positive language is something that I became really passionate about as a classroom teacher. I was really lucky to work in a school where teachers were expected to use positive language in the classroom. And, like all teachers, I sort of, found what worked for me and developed my own unique style. And then in becoming a parent, I got to put these positive language strategies into practice in the home setting, which has been really fascinating. And then, being able to work with other parents in this way is something that is really important to me as well. So if you follow Rose and Rex on Instagram at Rose and Rex, you might be familiar with the way that we share positive language strategies. We often use a commonly said phrase that many parents find themselves saying from time to time, and then share an alternative. Here's a phrase that we say, especially relating to negative behavior that we might find in our children. And here's something that we can say that teaches our children instead how to replace that behavior with positive alternatives. So that is, our philosophy of positive language. Instead of emphasizing negative behavior, teaching children how to replace negative behavior independently with kinder, safer alternatives. And also, we offer a full guide to positive language strategies, which I wrote, which offers lots of real life scenarios and very simple shifts that can help children, become more independent in problem solving and, relate to their peers and have more successful social interactions, and allowing us to sort of take a step back. By using these language prompts, we're able to teach our children what's expected of them and then sort of back off and let them be more independent in doing that work. So we'll talk more about this throughout our chat tonight. Basically, when Allie and I, the founder of Rose and Rex, were first talking about sharing positive language with parents and caregivers and educators, we acknowledge that there's an overwhelming amount of information out there about what we should be doing as parents, right? There's like a long list of all these things that we could be doing to support our children's development, to help them be the best that they can be. And I think that it all comes down to, thinking about my experience as an educator and a parent, that I know that our words matter. I could be caught up in so many things that I'm trying to do for my children, and I often am. I'm trying to balance a lot of things that I want to support them with and offer them. But at the same time, I'm really focused on my language. The words that we say to our children and around our children have a direct impact on not only how they see themselves, but also how they interact with others. So for me, prioritizing language and really focusing on my language as much as possible is what serves me best as a parent. And I also can feel good at the end of the day knowing that I've made an effort, that I'm being mindful as much as I can be about the words that I'm saying and the way that I'm speaking to my children. Children are constantly observing the people around them, especially the adults that they love and trust the most. And they're learning so much about social cues and body language, and the way that they interact with others is really based on what they see from us. So when children hear us, repeatedly use negative language phrases like, don't do this, or you can't do that, it it can cause them to doubt their own abilities. They can also miss out on valuable problem solving opportunities because we're the ones telling them what not to do all the time. And they can also struggle to resolve conflicts independently because, again, instead of learning alternatives to the things that we don't want them to do, we're simply trying to put an end to these behaviors. Positive language is so different because it empowers children to modify their own behavior. Like I said earlier, rather than emphasizing these negative behaviors, they're learning what to do instead. So, nearly everything that you can and want to say can be expressed through positive language. I think the simplest example that I often share in a workshop is related to food and meal times. So, instead of telling your child, don't throw food, instead you can say, food is for eating. And it seems like a simple shift and maybe something that you wouldn't say, food is for eating. But when you're saying don't throw food, you're really emphasizing the throwing of the food, which is what you don't want your child to do. By saying food is for eating to a baby or a young toddler, you're just reinforcing what you expect, and they're hearing the positive language. And also, a good thing to point out in the beginning is don't throw your food is considered a negative statement, not because it's bad or wrong by any means. Like, who wants their child to throw food? It's only considered negative because you're using the phrase do not. So that's a really important distinction to make early on when you're becoming familiar with positive language. It's not that negative language is bad and positive language is good. It's that we're going from emphasizing negative behavior to teaching positive alternatives, and doing that through language. So that's why it's called positive language strategies. In the early days of teaching, I would come home and share with my husband, oh, I'm experimenting with these positive language strategies in the classroom, and I'm finding it so much easier and more enjoyable to manage the class, and the children are really responding. And he was really supportive, but he also was very skeptical once I also shared that, at that time we didn't have children. I said, this is how I want us to parent and speak to our children as well. And that's where he was a bit skeptical. He didn't think positive language would feel natural. He was afraid it would feel sort of scripted. He would raise concerns to me like, it's going to be too challenging for me to censor myself. And why can't I just say what I mean? And also, isn't it easier for children to understand just simple statements like no, or don't throw your food, or stop doing this? And I totally understood where he was coming from. Given that I had the classroom experience and he didn't, I knew there was a bit of disconnect there. But the reality is that negative language can actually be really confusing to a child because they're hearing what they shouldn't be doing, what you don't want them to do, but they're not getting any information about what they should be doing instead. And so many of these scenarios are related to impulse control or challenging behaviors, or times when your child just can't be their best. And that's when they really need that support of learning from us, that model of what they should do instead, which takes a lot of practice. I think the personal reality for me is that there are definitely times when I'm using positive language with my children, and the things that are coming out of my mouth might be positive language, but what I'm thinking in my head is certainly more frustrated. I give the example of my son went through a really major, like, climbing on the coffee table phase around two. Um, and I would constantly be trying to find other things for him to climb on because I knew that the impulse was coming from he needed to climb. But to me at that time, like, the coffee table was not appropriate for climbing. It wasn't safe, it was dangerous, it could get damaged, etc. So instead of saying, don't climb on the coffee table, I would say, it looks like you need to climb. Here are some cushions you can climb on. And what I was really thinking in my head was probably some sort of profanity about, like, why can't he just get off the coffee table? But that wouldn't serve us as well. He wouldn't be learning, oh, when I have this feeling that my body really needs to move, I need to go to this cushion instead of the table. So, I think that it's important to consider that I'm all about being authentic with my children, and we'll talk about that more later. But there are definitely times where, to help our children learn these positive alternatives, we have to lead with that. And you can say positive language statements, especially when you're trying to set a limit, which we'll also discuss, with a very firm voice and with some serious facial expressions. It doesn't mean that when you're using positive language, you're just saying positive things or expressing positive feelings all day. That's certainly not the case. You know, I think that there are many ways that you can be firm with your child and set clear limits using this approach. And you may sound more positive, but if someone is looking at the whole picture, they'll understand that you're being very clear and you're using a certain style of language to express what you would have expressed just in different words. I want to also share this 7 out of 10 rule, which is sort of how I survive most days right now. Um, when I was in grad school, training to be a teacher at NYU, I learned the 7 out of 10 rule. And it was this idea that as an educator, you should sort of think of your students at the end of the day and consider everything that you've said to that student and try to ensure that 7 out of 10 things you've said were positive instead of negative. So for me, sometimes I get really hung up on these instances where I've said something that I don't love, that I don't feel great about. And it's more helpful and healthier for me as a parent if I try to reflect on the whole day. At the end of the day, I know that certainly 10 out of 10 is not happening. But 7 out of 10 times, typically, I can use positive language versus negative language. One of the questions that came in during on the RSVPs, which thank you so much for sharing, like, amazing questions and really honest thoughts about positive language and where you are with communicating with your children. Someone asked, how do I recover from a moment where I've used negative language? How do I move on from a moment where I've used, tone or words that I'm not comfortable with or that I would prefer that I didn't use with my child? And I think that for me, from the very, very beginning, baby days, like even newborn, I try to be very transparent with my children and acknowledge or even apologize when I've spoken to them in a way that I feel is not my best. And for a young baby or a young toddler, it can be as simple as acknowledging, I'm sorry I used an angry voice. I was frustrated that it took us so long to leave the house this morning. And some people will argue, that's too many words. But I say that, language comes from somewhere. Language comes from, the language that a child hears is, what impacts what they will say eventually. And also, children's receptive language skills, what they understand, develop so much more quickly than their expressive language, than what they can say. So, if your baby understands more than what they can tell you, then there's no harm in, from the very beginning, getting in this habit of a parent of, when you say something that you don't love, that seemed a little harsh, or your tone was a little off, it's okay to acknowledge that with them. I think that in some ways it serves our kids really well that we can't speak positively 10 out of 10 times. And that 7 out of 10 is the goal and is the gold standard, because they need to see us make what we would consider mistakes or fail in front of them. And they need to see us and how we respond to those situations. So for me, when someone asks, how do I recover? I think that it's about acknowledgement. It's about meeting your child and sharing with them, this is how I spoke, this is what I was feeling and why I spoke this way, and I'm sorry, or saying, I'm going to try to do it differently tomorrow. Just as we would hope that they will be able to self reflect in this way too as they grow and develop. So thank you for sharing that question. That's like a great point. Okay, so here's how I would like our conversation to be structured. It's important for me to share with you that normally when we do in-person workshops, which do seem like a lifetime ago, I would spend maybe an hour and a half with parents in person and give a brief overview of positive language strategies, And then parents would ask, individual questions that they're wrestling with, and phrases that they're really trying to shift from negative to positive. So for today, I want to focus on a couple different things, but I also want to share with you that there's a big piece of communicating with our children that I won't be able to get into tonight, just in terms of time. So today we will talk about how to transform negative to positive statements. And then we'll also talk about strategies for using positive language during really challenging moments. And I've chosen a few different broad categories of challenging behaviors that I think we could get started with. And then also in that conversation, I want to talk about how you can set limits for your children using positive language. And a big piece to that puzzle is meaningful consequences. So we'll talk about that. What we will not talk about, which I'm so passionate about, is what I call the great praise debate, and the way that we communicate with our children, the difference between praise and encouragement and why it matters, how praise differs from positive language, and how, by encouraging our children to be self reflective and encouraging their effort rather than praising their accomplishments or products of their work, can really help them become self motivated rather than praise seeking. So that's something that you'll also find in our guide to positive language strategies. Some really like in-depth examples about praise, and what to do instead of praising our children on a regular basis. We won't have time to get into it tonight, but we will start with transforming negative to positive. Um, Also important to note, it is absolutely okay and expected and celebrated when there are moments of safety concerns, to just say whatever you need to say in that moment to get through to your child. Can you shout no or stop or whatever you need to say to get their attention? Of course. I think that for me, I found that similar to what I use for positive language statements, telling my child exactly what to do during a scary situation is the best way to get a quick, immediate, and safe response. So if my children are scooting too close to the street, they're going on the sidewalk and maybe they're going to stop, but maybe it's a little too close for my comfort, I will shout to them, freeze or freeze your body rather than stop, because freeze is an action that they can take on. We've done tons of freeze dance games, so they know how to, manipulate their body in that way, how to stop within just a moment. So for me, freeze and freeze your body is my safety go to. So you just have to find what works for you and your family, but please don't find that you need to, really figure out how you're going to approach these situations in a more positive language approach. When safety is a concern, just whatever you need to do is, of course, totally fine. Um, Going back to meal times, I think that especially with the younger crew that we have with us this evening, again, this simple phrase of don't throw your food becoming food is for eating. One thing that is important to note about positive language strategies is that often the younger the child, the more they might respond to a physical gesture that's paired with the language. So if I'm going to say food is for eating, I'm actually going to say, food is for eating, and motion to my face. Sometimes a baby or toddler needs something else to do with their hands. If they're throwing food on the ground, then, introducing or reminding them of the ASL all done can be really helpful. You could say, are you all done? Um, Also, this detective work, which is something that will serve us well from babyhood to teenager days, really trying to think about, why is this behavior happening? Sometimes we won't know. Sometimes there are going to be phases that our babies or children go through and they pass, and we think, I never figured that out, and then it disappeared. And often I think, like, thank goodness it disappeared. Maybe it will come up again and we'll figure it out then. Um, but other times, if you really get a sense that something is becoming a habit of a negative behavior, you can sort of look to see what triggers it, what comes before the behavior, or is it certain times of day happening more frequently? If meal times become a real struggle, then there might be some things you need to shift around in the mealtime. Throwing food is something that developmentally most children do at one point or another. And in the very beginning, it can be an experiment of gravity, of watching things fall to the floor. But when you get to the point where you feel like your baby has developed past that stage, then that's a time where you might need to use some of these strategies. Throwing food or pushing food off a plate is usually, not always, but again, could be gravity experiment. Also could be your baby's signal in the way of communicating that they are done with that meal or they don't prefer that food on their plate. And that's when you need to replace the throwing the food with a different behavior. You don't want them to just stop throwing their food. You want them to do something else instead. So you could show them that the signal is, oh, looks like you're all done. You can say, all done, mama. Or it looks like you're all done. Please pass your plate to mama. So show them that to signal at the end of the meal, instead of throwing their food off the floor, they're going to pass you something. It also makes them feel really powerful when they know what to do. As babies and toddlers grow and develop, they're happy to be able to express themselves in more and more ways. So giving them that cue can really be a helpful shift. Um, what else? Okay, so, and also, very clear statements, I would also consider positive language. Things like, please keep your cup on the plate, because you're telling them what to do. It's different than like, don't knock your cup over or be careful. Just be very specific about what you need them or want them to do. Please keep your cup on the tray, or cup on the tray, please, depending on how much language your child is responding to. Um, the next example I want to give for a simple negative to positive shift is around throwing. Throwing, again, is something developmentally that most children will do from time to time. Um, for this example, I'll use sand. So if your child is throwing sand, instead of saying stop throwing sand, you can show them what to appropriately do. So I would say sand stays inside the sandbox, and I would give them that physical gesture to pair with it. It's important, again, for them to hear repetitively what is appropriate and what is expected of them, and how to safely play beside peers. Um, I think that with this approach, one of the greatest benefits as a parent, for both you and your child, is that you don't need to hover over your child with constant safety or kindness reminders. Because if your approach is not that you're putting an end to a behavior and you're teaching your child how to replace it with a positive alternative, then you don't always have to be the one saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't throw sand, stop throwing sand. If you're teaching them over and over again, sand stays inside the sandbox, then you can take a step back, because your child will eventually either say it to themselves when they're very young, or they'll practice that gesture because they've seen you model it many times. And then you can take a step back. Telling your child to stop doing something isn't a long term solution, because they don't know what to do instead. So that's like the most basic form of the entire approach that we could talk days and days about. But sand throwing or any kind of throwing is a good one. Instead of don't throw your toys, remind them what that specific toy is for. Trucks are for rolling. And then, of course, we'll talk about in a few minutes, what do you do when you're using the positive language statements and you've used them enough and you know that your child understands exactly what's expected of them, but they continue with the negative behavior. So then, of course, we have to, shift gears. And that's where meaningful consequences come into play. So I think that's important to note, that you're teaching them how to replace. You want to try to get out of this mindset of that need to be right there and hovering. With more repetition, these things will become known to your child of what's expected of them. And then when you pair them with the meaningful consequences, they'll understand what happens when they don't follow through the way that they've been taught. And something that comes up sometimes in workshops or in working with parents individually, through consultations, is families become so hyper aware of their language and so mindful, which I really respect. I think that sometimes they feel a little trapped, like it's so much on them to say the right thing, and they're worried that their language prompts are going to be what their child depends on. Well, if I'm saying these things and I'm teaching them what they should be doing, then are they going to need me there to always tell them what to do? Like, if I just told them no or stop, wouldn't they have to figure it out on their own? um, and I definitely hear that. I think that once you've put it into practice, you will see that you will be able to back away, that children can really grasp these language concepts and then independently put them into practice. And you won't need to be hovering the way that you might be if you're in the mode of telling them what not to do, you know, often. Okay, so then for positive language and how to help your child through challenging situations using your language, we're going to start with talking about meaningful consequences. So, what does that mean? A meaningful consequence is a consequence that is directly related to your child's behavior in a particular moment, and the consequence is introduced immediately or as soon as possible. So I would give an example of, something is happening in the morning that is totally not appropriate. And you think of something that your child really loves, like dessert after dinner. And at 9 a.m., you say, that's it. Because you did this, you have no dessert after dinner. So the reason why that doesn't feel like a meaningful consequence to me is that likely whatever your child was doing at that moment is not related to food or dessert. It's not like they were opening the freezer and, pouring out all the ice cream. And then it would sort of make sense that they had no dessert because they were doing something revolving around dessert. And also that it's so far, like the consequence will be so many hours later after the behavior that it's not as meaningful for your child. So much will happen during the day, and then you'll have to be reminding them that they're going to experience this consequence because of something that they did so long ago. So, my favorite example to use for what I do consider a meaningful consequence to be is stalling in the bedtime routine. So, let's say your child knows exactly what is expected of them. Say your bedtime routine is toothbrush, bath, and books. And on one night, your child is just really putting down his foot, won't come when you call him to brush his teeth, just refusing to clean up, taking a long time on purpose, ends up like laying on the floor and just not wanting to go. At that point, I would say, I've called you to brush your teeth 3 times. It's taking a really long time for you to get ready for bed tonight. And tonight, we only have time for one story, not two, like we usually do. And to me, it's a meaningful consequence because the stalling, the taking up time on purpose is directly related to not having enough time to do the desired activity. And it's meaningful because it's something that's going to directly follow whatever you're doing right now. So it's just sort of part of that experience. It's not something that's far removed or separate. And it also shows that when you take a long time to do what our family does every day as our expected routine, then you don't get to do part of the routine that you really look forward to. Um, I think that meaningful consequences are something that, as a family, take a lot of practice to get what you feel comfortable and what works for you in your repertoire. And there also is a very fine balance of finding something that feels actually meaningful to your child that they will miss if it becomes removed or it's part of a consequence, but not something that's so meaningful that it's going to disrupt the rest of their day, especially if it's a bedtime routine situation. I'm really sensitive about that. For our family, 2 books has been our beloved bedtime routine since my son was born. And taking away one of those 2 books is something that really impacts him. So I know that when the stalling or the not cleaning up the room before bedtime happens, that like if I have to get there, that this is something that will actually matter to him, which is the point. But I don't feel comfortable personally taking away both of those books because I know that the book before bed helps him feel secure and loved. And to me, I want to teach him that stalling changed, you know, the way that our day was going to go and that he's going to miss something that he enjoys doing. But I don't want it to be so disruptive that he can't go to sleep, or that he's, weeping at the end of the day that, all books are gone forever. So you do have to walk that balance. If you find that you're offering the same meaningful consequence many times, maybe it isn't so meaningful. Maybe whatever the consequences doesn't really matter to your child. And also, again, do that detective work and try to figure out, like, why is this behavior still happening when I'm using a meaningful consequence? Like, what is it that's making this repeat? Is it the consequence not being um, felt enough, or is there something that is triggering the behavior that we could sort of address? So I would say that, people who are unfamiliar with a positive language approach to parenting sometimes do question, or just sort of poke a bit about boundaries. And I think that without fully understanding the approach, it seems to people sometimes like, oh, if you use positive language, you're just saying yes all day, or your kids are getting away with everything, or it's a slippery slope. And I think that when positive language statements are paired with meaningful consequences, your children know what's expected of you, and they also, there is a consequence, there is a follow-up when they don't do their part or follow through, which is going to happen, and it's part of the learning experience. I think that meaningful consequences are a way to get behavior results in a very different way than unrelated punishments. And to me, that's what's resonated with me, in the classroom and at home, and something that I found my children to respond to most of the time. They're not going to, 100% of the time, maybe respond the way that we would wish that they would, of course. But for us, meaningful consequences works, and it's a powerful way to show your children too that their actions matter, because then whatever follows is related to that action. So sometimes finding those meaningful consequences can be tricky, or sometimes something will happen and then afterwards my husband and I will sort of like quietly whisper, like, what is a meaningful consequence to this? Like, what can we do to show him that this is not appropriate? And I'm grateful that we're sort of on that same page. And sometimes it does feel like a struggle. Like sometimes it's like, oh, if I just took this away, then maybe he would understand he shouldn't act that way. But I do want to try to find things that relate to whatever is happening and introduce them, as quickly as possible. If something has happened and I can't think of something meaningful in that moment, and I also try to be really consistent. So once I say a consequence, I'm going to really try to follow through. So if something is happening with one of my children and I just don't know what a meaningful consequence is at that moment, but I know that we have to follow up in some way, occasionally I will say, what just happened, or the way that you handled or said this, or this was, and I'll say it was either like unkind or unsafe or inappropriate, whatever it may be. And I'll say, like, I'm going to need to think about this, to figure out what we should do about it. And I want to just be open that, you're not getting off the hook, but like, I'm not really sure what is a meaningful way to approach this. And it doesn't happen often, but when it does, I'd rather do that than say something that is totally unrelated and unmeaningful to my child. Or, like I said with the two books, like, I don't want to, in a very upset moment myself, take away something and then regret that, now bedtime is not happening because I was a little bit too firm. So that balance is probably the trickiest. Then, in terms of positive language strategies during difficult moments, I would say sharing is a big one. Sharing is something that our children are going to practice from birth until forever. And positive language is something that will really serve your family well with sharing. Starting with grabbing, again, by saying don't grab. You're stopping the grabbing at that moment, but it's an impulse. And the next time your child feels that impulse to grab, they're not going to know what to do instead. So, something that gets really amazing results is pointing out who's using whatever your child is grabbing. So, instead of saying don't grab, you might say, Jamie's using that truck. I see the school bus and the cement mixer are available. So you identify who's using what your child wants. Even if your child's hand is already on it and they know who that child is, just say that person's name, even if it's their sibling. Um, Identify who is using it to sort of just bring that to their attention. And then the next really important step is to identify things that are available for them to use. And with repetition, your child will eventually shift that impulse to approaching someone or grabbing something to scanning the play space and choosing something for themselves. It doesn't mean they're always going to love it. Like, there are going to be times when they still want what the other person has, but in terms of that grabbing behavior, you can replace it with that alternative. It was something that my son started doing right before two. I remember seeing him approach children in the shared sandbox and sort of pausing begrudgingly and looking around and just sort of choosing something else. And I knew that it came from that repetition and practice. So give that a try for grabbing. Um, on the flip side, something that we've shared a lot on Instagram in terms of strategies for sharing is helping your child when someone is trying to take from them. So often as parents, or caregivers or whoever it may be, there is a big push for children to share. You might hear it in public places if you're spending time in public places, but telling children share, share. And a lot of times it's said when a child is approaching, let's say a child is approaching my child and grabs something from them, other adults might say, oh, share, share, like, oh, you can be finished with that, or oh, you can give them a turn. But if a child is in the middle of using something, in my opinion, it's okay for them to not give it up in that moment. I don't want to teach my children that sharing is just giving away something that's important to you the moment someone expresses any interest in it. Sharing is about compromise. So for me, if a child is approaching my child and my child is still using something, especially if they're already reaching for it, I'll say to my child, tell him I'm still using this. Or tell him you can have a turn when I'm finished. But just to acknowledge that, your child doesn't necessarily need to be expected to share all the time, and how to navigate those situations. I really try to push my children to say it for themselves. If they panic or if they're upset or if the child is being really physical trying to take something from them, I will step in and I will say, Violet was still using this on her behalf. I try to quietly say, tell him I'm still using it. And if she can't, then I will try to say it for her. Or I tell my children, now my son is in preschool and he'll come back and tell me about different scenarios that are happening. And I might say, well, first you try to tell that person, you say, I'm still using this, or whatever the case may be. And if that person has a hard time listening to you, or if you feel like you need some help or support, then of course go get a teacher. And the same for me, I try to encourage them to say it first themselves. And then if they need me, then of course I'm happy to reiterate, like, she told you she was still using it. I think sometimes it does cause some uncomfortable moments between parents or caregivers who are like, why can't she just share? But it's something that I feel very passionate about in terms of children having a voice, and knowing that there's a difference between compromise and just giving something up that's important to you. Again, as soon as someone expresses interest in it. And then the third scenario about sharing, that definitely helps in the home setting, with siblings, is involving children in the sharing process. I don't practice timed sharing with my children. Like, say there's one toy of the day that they just really can't get enough of, which tends to happen. So I wouldn't say to my children, you have the green train for 5 minutes and then Henry has the green train for 5 minutes. Because a lot of times then the person who was using it in the first place, like, they might have had an idea or a process and it gets interrupted. And then the child who gets it within 5 minutes also doesn't see that sometimes, there is a compromise and you do have to discuss, and that you do have to wait sometimes. So my preference in that scenario in using language to navigate that is to say, instead of saying, give the train to your brother in 2 minutes, I would say, when will you be finished with the train? And that's an open ended question on purpose. Older children might have a concept of time and say, I'll be finished in 2 minutes. So then, if it's a reasonable number, you could say, okay, I'll keep track for you and I'll let you know in 2 minutes when it's his turn, since you chose 2 minutes. I find that with my son, who's 4, it's often a more like process oriented answer. So if I say, oh, Violet really wants this green train, when will you be finished with it? He'll say, I'll be finished with it when it's, parked at the train depot. And then he feels like he has finished, and she sees that he was in the middle of something, and then it is her turn. And then you get to support the person who's waiting as well as the person who's figuring out how to wrap it up. So you can still, of course, encourage or even strongly encourage sharing, but it can be a matter of when or how they share, or how they're involved in that process, instead of um, forcing them to do it within a certain amount of time. And the other big thing that often comes up with what do I say, in terms of positive language for this kind of situation? I would say that physical situations are top on the list for most families, because that's the time where they really struggle with what to say. What do I say when my child is, hitting, kicking, biting, etc. Um, and figuring out meaningful consequences for those scenarios, it's pretty complex. I would say that in the guide, to positive language strategies that you can find on our site, there's a section dedicated to step by step how to do that work of figuring out why the physical behavior is there. And if you know why it's there, then you can replace it with a positive alternative. What does your child's body need in that moment? Or emotionally, what do they need in that moment? And what can we replace it with? I will say that, the phrase use your words is often a common response when children tend to get a bit physical with each other. Parents will interject, use your words, immediately. And the challenge with that is that these behaviors, these physical behaviors of pushing or even grabbing and hitting for sure, these behaviors are happening between children mostly when they don't have the language to express themselves in that moment, or they do have the language, but they can't access it because it's a stressful situation, which we as adults can totally relate to. If you're feeling stressed or overtired or hungry or insecure in some way, it's hard to express yourself the way that you need to or want to. And the same is true for our children. So instead of saying use your words, try providing your child with the words to say. Tell her I'm still using this, or tell him I need more space. And I think that that can really be a way of your child developing a toolbox of phrases to say during difficult moments that they can turn to. When they're told use your words, they don't have the words to say. And they also are getting that feedback that they're supposed to be handling this situation in a different way, but they don't know what to do or how to do it. So it's up to us to sort of give them some of those phrases. And again, you can back off eventually, depending on the age or the situation. Like some children need to hear these phrases a few times, and then they do become, with modeled language, they do become just part of their way of interacting with people. So don't think that you constantly have to be there saying, tell her do this, tell her do that. The point is to just shift the physical to saying these phrases, and then you can step back. One question that came through from the RSVPs for the webinar was how to be more patient during challenging moments, and a few people said, how to yell less. How during stressful moments can we change how we're speaking to our children? And I think that the key to that is when you are supporting your child by giving them these positive alternatives to replace the behavior, you're showing them what to do and telling them what to do. And then that gets to be your focus. So if you're having a moment where you're feeling as a parent like very worked up about what is going on, telling yourself, okay, I'm going to tell him what to do. I'm going to tell her what to say. I'm going to remind her how to handle this. Then that gives you something to do instead of yelling. That gives you something to focus on specifically. Like, think about, I need to help my child understand what is a kind, safe alternative. And that gets to be sort of your mantra to yourself when you're feeling like you're unraveling during these moments too. I have been using that with my own children in the way that they interact with each other. And it is definitely a work in progress right now with the 2 and 4 ages that we're at. But I often find that when my son is trying to communicate to my daughter, he will say, like, no, no, or don't do this, or, stop chasing me. And what she hears is chasing me, and she sees him running away. So she continues to chase him. So I try to help him pause, and I say, Henry, tell her what you need her to do, or tell her what would make you feel more comfortable. And then he's able to slow down and say, Violet, please give me space. And of course, sometimes she's going to respond and sometimes she's not, but it is so much more successful for him to communicate what he needs or what he wants in that moment, rather than what he doesn't like, or what is frustrating him, because then they just get sort of caught in this frustrating loop. So I wanted to share that can help you, in terms of those tricky moments when you feel yourself sort of escalating and using a tone or language or words that are not your ideal way of communicating as a family, to sort of just rein it back in and tell yourself, what I need to do right now is tell him how to be, um, how to be more kind and safer, etc. Um, Before we wrap up, I just wanted to quickly share 2 examples, for babies. I had a lot of questions come in about, when can we start? When should we start thinking about the language that we use, especially for families who are expecting? What are some things that we need to start thinking about right away? I think someone asked, what is the worst phrase that you could say to your child? So I think that it is never too early to be mindful of your language. I think that a lot of times during the toddler years, when there are perhaps more challenging behaviors, that's when a lot of families start to assess, how are we speaking as a family and what is serving us well and what isn't. But I think that more and more, before children have babies, or before parents have babies, or when children are very young, parents are starting to try to figure out how they feel about these things, and how they want to start. So the most common phrase, I would say, that I hear over and over again, that I try to shift to an alternative, would be when you comfort your baby and you say, you're okay, or it's okay. A baby is going to be comforted by your presence and your voice and just you, no matter what you're saying. So, of course, you can tell your crying baby, it's okay, you're okay. Um, However, because parenting habits, they form so quickly, and what you say now might stick with you and might be really challenging to shift in the future. I try to say instead, you're safe, or I'm here. And the reason why I make that distinction is because as your child grows and develops, when a child hears you're okay or it's okay and they don't feel okay, it can really diminish or rush their emotional experience. It can be really frustrating to be told how to feel when you don't feel that way, or it can make you feel like you're supposed to be okay when you just really aren't. So I would say, begin as you mean to go on if you can. And comforting your child by saying, you're safe, I'm here, or mama's here, is very different as they grow, than saying, you're okay, or it's okay. Because in that moment, you want to reassure them. As they grow, it won't be as reassuring to hear it's okay when they don't feel like it is. So for an older child, then that approach becomes, instead of saying it's okay, you would try to help your child identify how they're feeling and also figure out how to move on from that moment. And that's something that I talk about in the guide. There are definitely, phrases that are said to babies and to big kids. And the way that I would shift them to positive language would be different. So there are age modifications in the guide as well, because there are some situations like the you're okay, it's okay, where I would handle that very differently. For a baby, I would say, I'm here, you're safe. And I still say that to my 4-year-old, but I also then want to take it a step further. And I want him to figure out what he's feeling. And I also want to figure out what's going to help him feel better. Like those are the conversations we have. Or, how can we move on from this moment? What will we do next? And then the other phrase that has a huge distinction between how you would shift it to positive for a baby and an older child is hitting, or anything really physical. Let's say don't hit or don't pull hair. Um, for a baby, I would approach it by showing them what to do, because those kinds of physical interactions with a very young child, baby, young toddler, are often a way of them trying to connect with you, to play with you or get your attention or just to see what a response would be. However, that being said, it doesn't make it appropriate at any age. So, from the very beginning with the baby, if my baby was hitting at my face or pulling at my hair, I wouldn't just let it go, or treat it as a playful interaction. I would redirect it from the very beginning and say, "Gentle hands, please," because that shows them what we expect from them. And then I would also physically, say, "Gentle hands, please. You can touch mama's hair or you can rub mama's arm," to make that distinction. Of course, if your child is older and hitting you, gentle hands is not going to be inappropriate or enough of a response. So that's something that we explore in the guide as well. There are a few things that, you really have to change your response, but the goal is always the same. No matter where your child is developmentally, you want to take the negative behavior, and rather than emphasizing it by saying don't do that, you want to replace it with a positive alternative, through language. So that is a really bite-sized version of everything that we would love to share with you, about positive language. So please, check out our full guide on the site, and keep up with us on Instagram, where we're constantly sharing new positive language tips and strategies, for things that come up and timely things that come up. And I know that some people who joined the webinar tonight also joined recently, when I spoke about our online class for parents called Baby Play Basics. And that's a way that you can connect with your baby and support your baby's development through play. So if you aren't familiar with that, you could check that out as well, especially if you have youngers. So thank you so much for joining, and please keep in touch if you have any questions, or if you want to follow up about anything that we spoke about tonight. You can email me at lauren@roseandrex.com, and I hope to chat with you soon. Thank you so much. Bye.